drawing-room of the Montclair estate, casting long, sombre shadows across the polished parquet floor. Outside, a gentle autumn breeze rustled the trees, a contrast to the grim discovery that had thrown the household into panic. Lady Eleanor Montclair, a woman of impeccable taste and considerable social standing, had been found dead in her private study, a room notorious for its meticulous order and impregnable security. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows secured, and yet there she lay, slumped over her mahogany desk, a thin line of crimson staining the pristine surface. The scene was almost theatrical in its precision. Not a thing appeared out of place, no sign of struggle marred the elegance of the room, and yet the death was unmistakable. Poison, perhaps? A sudden ailment? The household staff whispered nervously, but all denied hearing or seeing anything unusual, their fear mingling with confusion. It was the peculiar clue, however, that drew the attention of Hercule Poirot when he arrived at the estate that evening. On Lady Eleanor's desk, neatly placed atop an unopened letter, was a small, seemingly incongruous object, a single porcelain chess-pawn, painted in an oddly chipped shade of emerald green. There was no chessboard in the room, no notes, no indication that Lady Eleanor had been involved in any game or intellectual pursuit connected to such a piece. Yet Poirot, observing with his characteristic intensity, recognized instantly that the clue was deliberate, a whisper of the murderer's mind, a signal meant either to mislead or to communicate something hidden. The piece's odd placement, balanced as if deliberately upright on the polished surface, suggested a meticulous hand, one confident in its actions, almost theatrical in its presentation. Poirot's eyes roved over the study with a meticulous precision that bordered on obsession. Every detail seemed designed to speak, yet spoke in riddles. The curtains, though heavy and luxurious, had no signs of tampering. The bookshelves were pristine, yet one shelf held a thin layer of dust, except for the neat vertical line of a removed book, now missing. The hearth was cold, yet the faint scent of almonds lingered, faint, elusive, the telltale aroma of cyanide, though one could not be certain. Poirot crouched, examining the floorboards, tracing the patterns in the parquet, noting the angles of the desk, the way light and shadow fell across the room. Nothing in the apparent disorder indicated forced entry or frantic struggle, and yet the death had occurred, an undeniable truth that contradicted the room's serene facade. The household itself offered no immediate answers. Lady Eleanor's husband, a dignified man with a penchant for stoicism, claimed to have been out on business in the city, providing a solid alibi, though Poirot's keen gaze suggested unease lurking beneath his composed exterior. The staff, all loyal and diligent, insisted upon their innocence, yet subtle signs betrayed tiny fissures. A servant's hand trembled slightly when recounting the day's events. A foot shuffled nervously beneath the crisp uniform of the housemaid. Each statement seemed rehearsed, too neat, like a veneer polished over something more sinister. Poirot's mind, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, noted the inconsistencies with precision. Even the maid's insistence that she had arranged the study earlier that morning hinted at knowledge of the room's order that went beyond simple service. Every word, every gesture, every hesitation, he catalogued it meticulously, knowing that the truth would reveal itself not in the obvious, but in the subtle, the overlooked, the deliberate misdirection. As night fell, the Montclair estate took on a spectral quality. The hallways echoed with Poirot's measured footsteps as he revisited each detail of the crime scene. His small, precise mind worked tirelessly, considering every scenario, testing every hypothesis. How could someone commit a murder in a locked room, leave a single puzzling chess piece as a clue, and vanish without a trace? The very impossibility of the crime thrilled him, stirred the little grey cells into motion, and he sensed that beneath the elegant calm of Lady Eleanor's study lay a labyrinth of motives, secrets, and small betrayals. Each member of the household held a potential key, though which was genuine and which was artifice remained a mystery. Poirot, with a quiet smile barely visible beneath his moustache, knew that the night was young and the challenge immense, but he was not a man easily bested. The unassuming chess pawn on the polished desk had already spoken, in its mute, deliberate way, signaling the beginning of a mystery that would demand every ounce of his extraordinary skill to unravel. The room, locked and pristine, seemed to whisper its secrets to him alone, daring him to decipher the logic beneath the chaos, to see what others could not. And Poirot, patient, precise, unrelenting, was more than willing to accept the challenge, a Hercule Poirot locked-room mystery. Poirot lingered a moment longer in the drawing-room, his gaze tracing the familiar lines of the furniture, the gentle curve of the fireplace mantel, and the polished surfaces that reflected the fading light. The local authorities had arrived shortly after him, bustling in with clipboards, gloves, and the polite efficiency of men accustomed to following procedure. Inspector Langford, a competent if unimaginative officer, began his methodical questions, recording statements with a mechanical precision that Poirot observed with quiet interest, while Langford focused on the obvious, the time of death, the last known movements, the alibis of household members. Poirot allowed his mind to wander into the spaces between facts, in the silences and the hesitations, where truth often hid. His attention first fell upon the desk itself. The single chess pawn had already intrigued him, but now, with the room's light fading to a dim amber, he noticed something subtler, a faint indentation on the blotter, just beneath the paper, as though a letter or document had recently been pressed there and removed. He leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and noted the edges were slightly dusted with powder, which the routine cleaning of the room had missed. It was the kind of detail no ordinary investigator would register, yet Poirot's small, precise eyes had seen it immediately. He lifted the pawn gently, rotating it between his fingers. A tiny scratch marred its base, a sign that it had been moved more than once, handled perhaps by more than one person. This was no idle ornament left by chance. It was a deliberate signal, a breadcrumb leading to something hidden in plain sight. Poirot then turned to the attendants, who had gathered quietly in the corner, whispering amongst themselves with nervous glances toward the study. Their composure seemed reasonable on the surface, yet something in the housemaid's behavior drew his attention. She claimed she had only entered the room to dust and rearrange objects earlier that morning. Yet when Poirot asked her to recount the sequence of her actions, she hesitated, her voice faltering just slightly. The brief flicker of anxiety, an almost imperceptible hesitation, was enough to suggest she knew more than she admitted. Her eyes darted toward the closed window and then to the heavy drapes, and Poirot, without needing words, sensed her mind calculating which small truths to reveal and which to withhold. His keen eye then noticed the placement of Lady Eleanor's desk chair. It was turned at a peculiar angle, as though someone had left in a hurry, yet no other signs indicated sudden movement in the room. The rug beneath was pristine, except for a faint scuff near the hearth. Poirot crouched to examine it and saw, almost imperceptibly, the trace of a tiny footprint, too small to be a man's, too light to register in routine inspection, yet unmistakable to one who looked closely. He straightened, a quiet smile brushing his moustache. Every element, no matter how innocuous it appeared, spoke of subtle deception. Someone had carefully orchestrated the scene, counting on the room's perfection to obscure their actions. Poirot then moved toward the bookshelves, where the missing volume had caught his attention earlier. He ran his fingers along the spines, noting the dust line and the faint impression left by fingers. The book had been deliberately removed, yet it was not missing entirely. It had been hidden, likely to prevent casual discovery. The detective's mind traced the possibilities: a motive concealed within its pages, a document stolen, or perhaps a cipher left as a clue. Each scenario, plausible on its own, required further evidence. Poirot's gaze flicked again to the chess pawn. He understood that the piece, small and seemingly insignificant, might reference a position on a board, strategy, movement, hierarchy. But for what purpose? For whom? That question lingered, unanswered, yet it narrowed the field of his inquiry. As the inspector continued his questioning, Poirot turned his attention to the servant's reactions. The butler, usually a model of stoic restraint, had a twitch of the eyelid each time a certain phrase was mentioned: Lady Eleanor's last meeting. Poirot noted it carefully, as well as the quick intake of breath by the cook when the word study was mentioned. Tiny, almost imperceptible signals, but for a mind trained in the art of detection, they were louder than any confession. Each had a story to tell. If only the detective could decode the subtleties hidden in gesture and tone. By the time night had fully descended, Poirot had gathered more than facts. He had collected the delicate threads of deception. Each object, each hesitation, each faint impression in the study spoke of a carefully constructed illusion, a labyrinth meant to mislead any investigator relying on surface appearances. Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities, connecting the dots invisible to all but the most meticulous observer. The authorities followed their standard routines, documenting, photographing, and measuring, but Poirot alone glimpsed the quiet choreography of a crime executed with precision. Somewhere, in that locked room and among the gathered household, the secret of Lady Eleanor's death waited to be revealed. And Poirot knew the key would lie not in the obvious, but in the careful, almost imperceptible misdirections that masked a deeper, darker intent. The game had begun, and every subtle clue, every minuscule reaction, was a move on a board he was already beginning to master. Poirot gathered the household in the library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of wax and aged paper. The fire cast a warm, flickering glow across the polished surfaces, yet the atmosphere was tense, each occupant aware that they were under scrutiny. Inspector Langford began with routine questions, but Poirot allowed him to speak while he observed, studying every gesture, every inflection. He noticed that the youngest maid, a timid girl with wide, nervous eyes, kept twisting the hem of her apron, her gaze darting repeatedly toward the locked study. Her answers were precise, almost rehearsed, yet her voice carried an edge of anxiety that betrayed her certainty. She knew more than she let on, but feared the consequences of speaking openly. The butler, a tall, rigid man whose composure seemed unshakable, recounted his day with meticulous detail, emphasizing his constant presence in the main hall. Yet Poirot noticed something subtle. When the topic shifted to Lady Eleanor's correspondence, his hands flexed involuntarily, a sign of internal agitation. He described having delivered a message to Lady Eleanor that afternoon, yet his version of events contained an inconsistency. He claimed the note was handed over immediately, yet the desk where it supposedly rested had no sign of disturbance. Poirot's eyes flicked to the faint indentation under the blotter once more, mentally noting the discrepancy. The cook, stout and earthy, spoke next, her voice carrying the rhythms of habitual storytelling. She insisted she had seen nothing unusual, yet Poirot detected a brief hesitation when asked about the afternoon meal. Her eyes flicked toward the pantry door, and Poirot, following the movement, imagined her thought process. She was weighing the truth against the consequences of disclosure. A small tremor in her hand betrayed the effort of holding back a significant piece of information. Poirot made a mental note. Even the seemingly honest had secrets, and each omission could be a clue. Lady Eleanor's nephew, a young man of nervous energy, was eager to speak, almost too eager. He launched into a detailed account of his own movements, emphasizing his absence during critical periods. Poirot listened patiently, noting that the narrative was polished, rehearsed, and lacked the small, unconscious slips that genuine speech carried. Yet in the cadence of his voice, the detective detected an undercurrent of defensiveness. When he was asked about the chess set in the drawing-room, his hands twitched, and he stumbled over a word. Subtle signs that betrayed both familiarity with the pawn and a desire to distance himself from it. Poirot then turned his attention to the governess, a woman of refined demeanor and keen intelligence. She spoke sparingly, almost measuredly, choosing her words with deliberate care. She claimed to have seen Lady Eleanor in the study only briefly, tending to some paperwork, but her eyes betrayed a hidden tension. When questioned about her knowledge of household arrangements, she offered vague answers, yet Poirot caught a faint smirk, as if some secret amusement or satisfaction lingered beneath her careful composure. Each carefully chosen word, each slight gesture, suggested a consciousness of more than she admitted, an awareness of events the others had overlooked. As the questioning continued, Poirot observed the subtle interplay of reactions. Some of the witnesses, overly eager to cooperate, revealed inconsistencies that grew clearer under careful scrutiny. Others withheld small, vital details, letting silence speak where words might betray their culpability. The detective sensed layers of deception woven into every response, a network of half-truths and calculated omissions. The subtle contradictions The timing of arrivals and departures, the precise wording of phrases, the tiny gestures, formed a pattern that Poirot catalogued meticulously. He could already sense the underlying motive, hidden beneath the layers of politeness and fear. The inspector, noting the contradictions, began to grow impatient, but Poirot's calm demeanor suggested he required more than mere statements. He needed the rhythm of behavior, the music beneath words, the movements of conscience and fear. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The study, the locked room, the chess pawn, they were elements of a performance, a stage upon which each actor had a role. The key would lie in understanding why each participant chose their part, and where the rehearsals of deception had faltered. By the end of the evening, the household had exhausted itself with statements and denials. Poirot, however, remained poised, his mind alight with possibilities. Each witness had revealed something crucial, even if inadvertently. Their gestures, their inconsistencies, their silences, all were notes in a subtle symphony of intrigue. As he stared at the chess pawn, balanced on the desk with deliberate precision, he realized that the voices of deception were not mere distractions. They were signposts pointing to the hidden hand that had orchestrated this seemingly unsolvable crime. Somewhere among these carefully constructed narratives, the truth waited patiently to be uncovered, and Poirot's small grey cells were already beginning to decipher the pattern hidden beneath the layers of artifice. Poirot remained in the library long after the witnesses had dispersed, the flickering firelight illuminating the careful lines of his face as he pondered the tangled web before him. Each member of the Montclair household possessed a motive, yet none could explain the murder in isolation. Greed, jealousy, fear, and resentment wove themselves into an intricate tapestry, each thread connecting one person to another in ways that were subtle but undeniably present. The butler, for instance, was devoted to appearances, yet a sharp mind could detect that his loyalty was measured, balanced against a personal grievance, a slight overlooked years ago, a pension denied, a quiet resentment that had festered in silence. Could such simmering indignation have escalated into murder? Poirot did not dismiss the thought. The nephew presented another puzzle. On the surface, his eagerness to clear himself seemed almost comical, but Poirot sensed a deeper anxiety. He had ambitions. The tea clashed with Lady Eleanor's control over the family fortune, a restrictive will, a promise of inheritance that would come only after certain conditions were met. Here was a motive painted in plain colors, yet complicated by the intricacy of the murder. To commit the crime, to leave a cryptic chess pawn as a signal, required a cunning beyond mere impatience or desire for wealth. Poirot considered whether this young man's nervous energy might mask cleverness or merely desperation. The governess, precise and self-contained, added another layer of complexity. Her loyalty to the family appeared unshakable, yet the faint hints of amusement at certain questions suggested hidden satisfaction. Poirot recalled the way her eyes lingered on the chess pawn, a subtle fascination that implied prior knowledge or personal connection to its meaning. Was this curiosity innocent, or a reflection of a concealed grievance, a quiet indignation or jealousy that made her privy to secrets others did not know? Even the smallest smile could conceal the deepest motives, and Poirot had learned that such subtleties were never accidental. The cook and the maid, both outwardly timid and deferential, were not without their own entanglements. The cook's brief hesitation when discussing the afternoon meal hinted at knowledge withheld, perhaps knowledge that carried consequences beyond mere fear of reprisal. The maid's nervous glances toward the study revealed more than timidity. They suggested an awareness of events, possibly minor participation that, though indirect, could be pivotal. Even the smallest of household staff could wield influence over events in a carefully maintained hierarchy, and Poirot catalogued each subtle movement with methodical care. Poirot began arranging these fragments mentally, noting how each alibi intersected and conflicted with the others. The butler's precise movements, nephew's eager timelines, the governess's careful words, and the staff's silences. Together they formed a lattice of opportunities and motives, a maze in which the truth was hidden. He realized that the murderer had relied on the very complexity of human desire, the tangled mixture of ambitions and resentments, to obscure their own actions. The locked study, the pristine desk, the cryptic pawn. Each was a mask, a diversion designed to exploit the natural weaknesses of the household, ensuring that curiosity would be misdirected, suspicion scattered. Poirot's mind returned repeatedly to the chess pawn, a symbol now layered with metaphorical resonance. Who could wield patience and precision sufficient to craft such a deliberate clue? The answer would not be found in greed alone, nor in fear, nor in jealousy. It would require someone with insight into human behavior, a capacity for subtle manipulation, and a mind capable of orchestrating events while remaining concealed behind a facade of normalcy. The murderer, he realized, had calculated not only the act itself, but the reactions it would provoke, the web of suspicion it would entangle, and the concealment it would provide. As he traced each thread, Poirot began to see faint patterns emerge. Certain statements, when compared, revealed contradictions that were too precise to be accidental. Minor resentments surfaced as hidden motives, layered beneath more obvious concerns. Timing, opportunity, and knowledge of the study's security became central factors, and Poirot's mind, with relentless precision, catalogued every detail. The maze of human emotion, greed, envy, fear, loyalty, was formidable, yet in its complexity lay the key. For in human behavior, as in chess, the careful moves of the pieces, no matter how subtle, ultimately revealed the player's intent. Poirot understood that he was not yet at the solution, but the 3D were converging. Each motive, each hesitation, each carefully controlled gesture was a step toward unmasking the orchestrator of this seemingly impossible crime. The game was far from over, yet the detective's small grey cells were already navigating the labyrinth, drawing closer to the truth hidden behind the locked door and the enigmatic green pawn. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to the Montclair estate, and the sunlight streaming through the tall windows made the drawing-room feel less oppressive, yet the shadows of the previous day lingered in every corner. Inspector Langford, bolstered by what he believed was a decisive discovery, summoned the household to the study. There, on the floor beside the desk, lay a small vial, its contents now confirmed as a potent dose of cyanide. It had been tucked beneath the rug, almost invisible to casual observation, and Langford proclaimed it the breakthrough that would close the case. The household collectively exhaled, some with relief, others with a tension that only those intimately involved could mask. The authorities, buoyed by what seemed an unassailable connection between the poison and Lady Eleanor's death, prepared to attribute guilt to the household's timid maid, whose nervous behavior had already drawn suspicion. Poirot, however, remained seated, hands clasped, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the meticulous scrutiny that had made him famous. The vial was indeed dangerous, but he felt no certainty that it revealed the truth. It was too convenient, too neatly placed, almost as if it had been positioned for discovery. The maid's terrified demeanor, the predictable tremor in her hands, the glances toward the study, they all spoke of fear and inexperience, not calculated murder. Poirot sensed the artificiality of the scene, a clever diversion intended to mislead even those who prided themselves on careful observation. While the inspector congratulated himself, Poirot examined the finer details. The rug, though seemingly ordinary, bore no trace of dust displacement where the vial had been found. It suggested the object had been placed there very recently, long after the room had been tidied. The green chess pawn, so pivotal the night before, remained on the desk, its tiny scratch now illuminated by morning light. Poirot's fingers traced the imperfection again, considering its origin. Whoever had orchestrated the placement of the pawn, and now perhaps the vial, possessed a keen understanding of human psychology, knowing how to provoke suspicion, redirect attention, and create an illusion of culpability. The household watched nervously, as Poirot finally rose to speak, his voice calm but imbued with the authority of one who sees beyond appearances. "Mes amis," he said, "the discovery of the vial is indeed significant, but it is not the whole truth. It is a convenient piece, yes, but convenience often disguises cunning. The murderer is not revealed by the evidence placed before our eyes. The murderer is revealed by the inconsistencies, the small gestures, the overlooked details." He paused, letting his words settle like a weight in the room. The maid's wide eyes flickered toward him, hope and fear mingling in equal measure. while Langford's confident smile faltered just slightly. Poirot then examined the staff's subtle reactions. The butler's hands remained rigid, yet a slight shift of weight, a twitch of an eyebrow, betrayed the tension he had carefully concealed. The governess, serene in posture, allowed her gaze to linger too long on the chess pawn, a faint trace of amusement at the chaos it caused. Even the cook's seemingly relaxed demeanor could not conceal the momentary flash of recognition when Poirot gestured toward the vial. Each observation reinforced what Poirot already suspected. The discovery of the poison was a misdirection, a brilliantly staged tableau designed to offer the illusion of resolution while the true orchestrator of events remained unseen. Poirot returned his attention to the study itself. The desk, the blotter, the missing book, the scuff of a small footprint near the hearth, they had all remained unaltered, yet their significance had been ignored in the excitement over the vial. The detective's mind traced the sequence of events, imagining how someone with patience and precision might manipulate suspicion, guiding the authorities toward the wrong conclusion while keeping the real murderer comfortably in the shadows. He understood that the crime was far from solved. As the morning progressed, the inspector prepared to file his report, certain that justice had been served. Poirot, however, did not move. He studied the chess pawn one last time, noting the deliberate angle at which it balanced, the faint scratch at its base, and the silent message it carried. A sense of quiet anticipation filled him. The criminal was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again, confident that a false victory would distract all from their true identity. Poirot's small grey cells were already active, piecing together the strands of this elaborate ruse, and he knew the day's events were merely the opening moves of a much larger, more intricate game. The challenge had only just begun, and he was determined to uncover the mind that had orchestrated such cunning. Leaving the household in suspense and the inspector in premature triumph, Poirot spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, pacing the corridors of the Montclair estate, allowing the rhythm of the house to speak to him. Each floorboard, each creak of the doors, seemed to whisper the echoes of events long past. It was in this deliberate solitude that his mind returned to a seemingly minor detail he had observed the day before, but had not fully explored, the engraving on the back of the green chess pawn. The letters, tiny and precise, read almost imperceptibly, L.C. 1912. A date, he realized, and the initials of someone whose identity had been concealed until now. Poirot's small grey cells leapt with interest. Could this relic of the past have a bearing on the present crime? He requested access to the Montclair family archives, a room rarely visited except on formal occasions. The heavy scent of old paper and leather greeted him as he examined ledgers, diaries, and letters that chronicled generations of the family. Among the records, a particular incident caught his attention, a minor scandal, almost forgotten, involving Lady Eleanor's father and a distant relative. A Mr. Lionel Carrington, whose name, he noticed with a spark of recognition, matched the initials on the chess pawn. Carrington had been implicated in a small embezzlement scheme, ultimately covered up by the family to preserve reputation. The connection was tenuous, yet the pawn suggested deliberate reference, as though someone sought to summon the memory of that long-buried event. Poirot then turned his attention to the current household, piecing together relationships that had seemed unremarkable until now. The governess, it appeared, was a distant cousin of this Lionel Carrington, a fact obscured by years of separation and deliberate discretion. The young nephew had been aware of family grievances that predated even his own birth, knowledge whispered to him in private conversations with Lady Eleanor herself. The butler, who had served the household for decades, had been present during some of these discussions, and the maid had been employed in the Montclair estate during visits by family friends connected to the Carrington line. Suddenly, the threads of connection extended far beyond mere coincidence. The household itself formed a lattice of inherited grievances and veiled loyalties. Poirot's eyes returned once more to the chess pawn, imagining it as a symbolic gesture rather than a literal clue. It was a silent message, a reminder of the past, a signal that motives were not solely of the present day but had roots entwined in long-forgotten family disputes. The crime, he realized, was not merely the product of greed or ambition. It was a calculated expression of vengeance, meticulously designed to invoke memory, to stir latent resentment, and to manipulate those who had once believed themselves removed from the grievances of previous generations. Each suspect carried the weight of history, knowingly or unknowingly, and the carefully constructed tableau of Lady Eleanor's death was a culmination of that hidden tension. Poirot summoned the household once more, requesting that they recount not only the events of the past day, but also any interactions with family members and distant relatives over the years. The governess hesitated when asked about her connection to the Carringtons, and the nephew's confident assertions faltered as he recalled private admonitions from Lady Eleanor about ancestral scandals. Even the butler, rigid as ever, could not conceal the flicker of recognition at certain names, the faint shadow of past loyalty competing with the fear of exposure. Poirot listened attentively, assembling a map of relationships, hidden grievances, and subtle dependencies that now seemed to converge on the present tragedy. As evening descended, Poirot pieced together the web of connections that had remained invisible to all but the most discerning observer. The crime was no longer merely a puzzle of locked doors and cryptic pawns. It was a manifestation of the long memory of human resentment, a reminder that the past never truly dies. Every gesture, every hesitation, every carefully placed clue was a thread linking the present to bygone disputes, and the detective's understanding of these shadows allowed him to glimpse the mind behind the murder more clearly. The Montclair household, serene in appearance, was a repository of history and hidden motives, and Poirot knew that to unravel the present crime, he must continue to trace the echoes of the past until the true culprit was revealed. In the quiet of the library, the detective allowed himself a faint smile, for the solution lay not in the obvious, but in the intricate interplay of memory, loyalty, and long-buried resentment, shadows that would soon step into the light. Poirot rose early the next day, the morning mist still lingering over the estate's gardens, and he resolved to employ a tactic that required no force, no intrusion, only the subtle probing of human psychology. He had noticed, in his careful observation of the household, that one detail consistently drew attention yet was never addressed directly: the chess pawn. Its symbolism, its deliberate placement, and the faint scratch on its base suggested a mind at play, confident, precise, and accustomed to manipulating perception. Poirot decided to test that mind, not with confrontation, but with suggestion. He called the household together in the drawing-room once more, arranging the chairs in a loose semicircle, the fireplace casting dancing shadows across their faces. Without accusation, without direct inquiry, he began to speak of the murder in terms of strategy and design, weaving a narrative of meticulous planning and psychological manipulation. He described, in detail, how a clever murderer might use a minor object, a piece of porcelain, perhaps a chess pawn, to mislead observers, to direct attention away from the true method and the true motive. As he spoke, he watched carefully, observing reactions not in the words spoken, but in the micro-expressions, the shifts of weight, the subtle tightening of muscles, the almost imperceptible glance toward the study. The governess's posture, calm and controlled as it had seemed, suddenly betrayed a flicker of unease. Her fingers, resting neatly in her lap, flexed minutely, as if grasping at an invisible clue. Her eyes, previously serene, now darted toward the desk where the pawn rested, a small tremor betraying a deeper recognition. Poirot's attention sharpened. He knew that the mind capable of planting the pawn and orchestrating such precise misdirection would react, even if only unconsciously, to a discussion of the strategy behind the murder. Without hesitation, Poirot subtly altered his approach. He spoke of a murderer who understood family dynamics intimately, someone who could anticipate reactions, someone who could use fear, loyalty, and memory to manipulate others. He mentioned, almost in passing, how a perpetrator might reference past grievances as a psychological device, weaving old disputes into the present to create a compelling yet misleading narrative. The governess's hand twitched slightly, her eyes shifted, betraying a heightened awareness, as though she was struggling to maintain composure under the invisible pressure of Poirot's observation. Poirot then paused and leaned forward, speaking softly, his voice deliberate. Imagine, mes amis, that the smallest action, a seemingly trivial gesture, might betray the greatest secret. Even the most careful of us can leave a mark without realizing it. Even the most controlled hand may falter when reminded of the past. His gaze swept slowly across the assembled household, lingering on the governess, whose carefully maintained mask was beginning to show cracks. A flush rose to her cheeks, subtle but unmistakable, and she shifted in her seat, a small but telling act of discomfort. The detective allowed the moment to linger, his eyes unblinking, reading every movement. Then he spoke of opportunity, of timing, of the knowledge required to exploit a locked room and create a false narrative. The governess's hands, once still, now fidgeted with a handkerchief. Her breathing quickened imperceptibly, and she cast a fleeting glance toward the study door. Poirot noted each detail, filing them meticulously in his mind. The carefully controlled narrative she had maintained, the calm, detached demeanor, the readiness to answer questions, was beginning to unravel, revealing subtle but undeniable signs of complicity. Finally, Poirot leaned back, his voice calm, almost conversational, and allowed silence to fall over the room. The governess, realizing the intensity of his scrutiny, could not maintain her composure entirely. Her eyes met his, a brief flicker of fear and recognition passing between them, as though she knew that her careful misdirection had been observed and catalogued. Poirot, patient and precise, understood that this reaction was significant, a psychological fracture in the facade she had maintained so meticulously. In that quiet moment, Poirot realized that the unconventional tactic, the careful manipulation of suggestion, the subtle exploration of human reaction, had borne fruit. The true murderer had revealed a crack, not in words, but in gesture and expression. The chess pawn, the overlooked symbol of the past, had drawn forth a response that could not be faked. The detective's insight had pierced the veneer of propriety, exposing the first real indication of the hand that had rated Lady Eleanor's death, and he knew that the final unraveling of the mystery was now within his reach. Poirot spent the following afternoon quietly observing the Montclair household, careful to avoid drawing attention to his scrutiny. The chess pawn still rested on Lady Eleanor's desk, its green surface catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if it were a sentinel waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Poirot's mind turned over the reactions he had observed the day before, the governess's fleeting tremor, the subtle tension in her hands, the quickened breathing when he spoke of past grievances, and he devised a tactic to probe these reactions further without direct accusation. He requested that the household gather once more in the drawing-room, this time under a pretense of discussing the arrangements for Lady Eleanor's memorial. The room was filled with polite, restrained chatter, yet Poirot subtly guided the conversation toward matters of inheritance, family history, and the importance of small, overlooked objects as symbols of memory and authority. He spoke casually of the chess pawn, describing it not as evidence, but as a trivial object capable of drawing attention to past conflicts and hidden resentments. His words were calm, conversational, yet deliberately suggestive, designed to press upon the subconscious of whoever had orchestrated the crime. As he spoke, Poirot watched the governess with careful intensity. At first, her expression remained controlled, her composure seemingly unshakable. But as he described how even the smallest gesture or object could betray intent or reveal knowledge of private matters, her fingers twitched against the handkerchief in her lap, a motion almost imperceptible to anyone else. Her eyes, previously calm, darted toward the desk, and she swallowed audibly, a subtle but telling reaction. Poirot's heart quickened, not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of seeing human nature respond to the quiet pressure of suggestion. He continued, elaborating on the cunning of a murderer who understood the psychology of those around them, one who might use fear, loyalty, and memory to mislead observers, planting symbols and diversions to create an illusion of guilt elsewhere. Poirot did not look directly at her at first, but gradually allowed his gaze to meet hers, and he saw the almost imperceptible flicker of recognition. Her breath caught, her hands flexed, and a slight involuntary backward shift in her posture betrayed a sudden awareness that she had been seen, not in action, but in intent. Poirot then spoke of opportunity and the precise knowledge required to manipulate the environment of the locked study, to orchestrate the timing of movements and place objects deliberately, creating false narratives that even the most diligent observer might accept as truth. As he mentioned the clever use of small details to mislead, the governess's eyes widened fractionally, a crack appearing in the mask of composure she had maintained so carefully. Poirot noted every micro-expression, the fleeting tension of her shoulders, the rapid flicker of her pupils, the slight tightening of her jaw. These were not actions that could be consciously controlled, they were the silent language of guilt. Finally, Poirot allowed a pause, letting silence linger while the firelight danced across the assembled faces. The room was still, save for the quiet breathing of the household members. The governess's hands fidgeted with the handkerchief again, her gaze shifting nervously to the chess pawn on the desk. She tried to recover her composure, but the slightest quiver in her voice betrayed the subtle crack that Poirot had been waiting to observe. The detective's careful application of psychological pressure had drawn forth a response, an involuntary signal that could not be feigned. In that quiet, suspended moment, Poirot understood that the unconventional tactic had succeeded. He had not forced a confession, nor had he confronted the suspect directly. Instead, he had allowed the interplay of suggestion and human instinct to reveal the first clear evidence of complicity. The governess, whose controlled demeanor had so far misled the authorities, had unconsciously acknowledged her connection to the crime. The chess pawn, the small, overlooked symbol of the past, had done its work, prompting a reaction that would now allow Poirot to trace the final steps toward unmasking the murderer. The threads were beginning to converge, and the detective knew that the resolution of Lady Eleanor's death was now within reach, hidden only by the final layers of cunning yet to be unravelled. The following evening, the Montclair estate was draped in shadows, the fading light of dusk seeping through the tall windows and lending a sombre air to the halls. Poirot had spent hours retracing every step of the previous days, reviewing the details of gestures, hesitations, and subtle clues, confident that the psychological probe had revealed the first real fracture in the governess's carefully maintained facade. He believed the path to uncovering the truth was now clear, each piece of evidence forming an invisible chain that, once linked, would lead inevitably to the culprit. Yet when he returned to the study to examine the chess pawn once more, a shock of unease struck him. The green pawn, which had served as the linchpin of his latest deductions, was gone. The desk, previously polished and orderly, showed a faint smudge where the piece had rested, as if lifted in haste. Poirot crouched to examine the blotter and the small indentation beneath, now disturbed in a way that suggested deliberate removal. His instincts, honed by decades of observation, told him immediately that this was no accident. Someone had entered the room after his absence, carefully taking the pawn in order to erase a crucial trace of motive, to obstruct the course of justice before it could reach its inevitable conclusion. He called the household together again, but the governess's reaction was subtle yet telling, a fleeting glance toward the doorway, her hands brushing nervously over the folds of her dress. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unrelenting, noted the minute tremor of her fingers and the slight tension of her shoulders. It was the reaction of someone who had anticipated this moment and had likely orchestrated it herself. The theft of the pawn was not merely an act of panic. It was a deliberate attempt to manipulate perception to suggest that the crucial link he had discovered was fragile, perhaps even non-existent. Inspector Langford, confused and frustrated, demanded to know who could have taken it. But Poirot raised a hand, signaling patience. He had learned that haste, indignation, or blunt confrontation rarely revealed the truth. Subtlety was the key. He began examining the room once more, noting minute details overlooked by ordinary eyes, the faint dust on the hearth, the scuff of a footprint near the rug, and, most significantly, the slight shift of objects on the bookshelves. Someone had moved carefully, but not perfectly, leaving traces for an observant mind to detect. Poirot catalogued each disturbance meticulously, reconstructing the sequence. The perpetrator had known precisely what they sought to remove, and the removal had been calculated to delay, confuse, and intimidate. As he pieced together the movements, Poirot considered the wider implications. The governess, now suspect number one, had both motive and knowledge. But could she have acted alone? The subtle hints in her behavior suggested confidence, not desperation. She had been practiced in concealment, yet the timing and precision of the pawn's disappearance indicated an accomplice or someone with equal cunning. Poirot's mind traced the possibilities. The butler, the nephew, even the maid could have played a role, whether through direct intervention or unwitting compliance. The house, once a static tableau, had become a dynamic arena of hidden maneuvers, each designed to mislead and conceal. The disappearance of the pawn elevated the stakes immeasurably. Evidence, once tangible and deliberate, had been rendered uncertain. Trust among the household had grown fragile. The maid's nervous glances, the butler's taut posture, the governess's subtle reactions, all were now magnified, carrying the weight of suspicion and fear. Poirot knew that the true criminal would watch these reactions carefully, confident that confusion would obscure detection long enough for them to consolidate their advantage. Yet he also knew that those who manipulate others so cleverly often leave the smallest trace of error, a telltale mark for a detective trained to observe beyond the obvious. With renewed determination, Poirot began tracing the shadows of the night, where the thief could have entered unnoticed, which surfaces bore the imprint of hasty movement, and which subtle behaviors might indicate guilt. He understood that the stolen pawn was more than a missing object. It was a symbol of the murderer's audacity, a signal that the game had grown more complex and dangerous. And in that complexity lay the opportunity, for those who watched carefully, who read gesture and hesitation with precision. The truth remained accessible, waiting to be revealed. Poirot's small grey cells, undaunted, were already at work, reconstructing the vanished evidence and preparing for the revelation that would expose the criminal hiding in plain sight, confident yet vulnerable beneath the layers of their own cunning. The evening was heavy with fog, curling around the Montclair estate like a silent, watchful presence. Poirot had spent hours retracing the movements of the household, carefully reconstructing the timeline and cataloguing each subtle reaction. The stolen chess pawn had cast a shadow over the investigation, yet he felt certain that the cracks in the governess's composure would lead him to the truth. He had not anticipated, however, the audacity of the mind he was pursuing. As he returned to the drawing-room, the quiet was shattered by a shrill scream from the corridor outside. Poirot's senses, honed through decades of observation and danger, sharpened instantly. He darted forward, his small frame moving with the precision of a panther, and found the young nephew sprawled at the foot of the grand staircase, pale and shaken. In his hand he clutched a crumpled note, its ink smeared as though hastily written. "The game is far from over. Watch closely or you will be next." Poirot's eyes swept the hallway, noting the faint disturbance of the dust on the polished floor, the subtle scuff marks that suggested a rapid departure. The fog outside lent the scene an eerie ambiguity, masking potential escape routes, and the detective felt a flicker of unease. The villain was not only clever but bold, prepared to escalate the stakes to ensure confusion and fear spread through the household. It was no longer simply a matter of uncovering a past murder. Now the safety of the remaining members was directly threatened. The governess appeared at the end of the corridor, her composure shattered by the scream. She clutched her shawl tightly, her knuckles white and her eyes flickered with fear, but also, Poirot noted, with a shadow of calculation. She asked rapidly what had happened. "D." Her voice pitched just above panic, yet each syllable was carefully measured, revealing the tension between genuine alarm and a practiced instinct to manipulate perception. Poirot made no immediate reply, instead scanning the scene for other clues, the footprints in the dust, the subtle shifts of displaced furniture, the small smudges along the edges of the rugs. It became immediately clear that the second crime, or at least the threat it embodied, had been executed with precision. The note, hastily scrawled, was itself a psychological tool, a taunt designed to provoke both fear and overreaction. Poirot understood that the villain's strategy was as much about controlling perception as it was about action. Each calculated disturbance kept the household off balance, forcing them into reactive patterns rather than rational analysis. He noted the absence of any weapon, no sign of forced entry, and no immediate indication that the nephew had been harmed beyond shock. This was deliberate, a warning shot rather than a finished act of violence, and it revealed the mind behind it to be audacious and cunning beyond ordinary expectation. Poirot motioned for the household to remain calm and confined, directing Langford to secure all entrances and exits. He then turned his attention back to the note, inspecting the handwriting with keen scrutiny. The slant, the pressure of the ink, the minute tremors in certain letters, these were all traces of the hand that had left it. Comparing them in his mind to the governess's carefully maintained writing in her personal ledger, he noted subtle similarities, yet also distinctions that suggested a deliberate attempt at disguise. The villain was toying with them, but in the process had left the faintest threads of identity, enough for a master observer to follow. Poirot's gaze returned to the young nephew, whose breathing was uneven and eyes wide with lingering terror. The detective placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, speaking softly to calm him, while simultaneously piecing together the broader strategy of the criminal. Whoever had orchestrated this had anticipated every movement, every reaction, and had designed the incident to buy time, distract attention, and conceal their own plan. The second act of aggression confirmed that the initial murder was not an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern, a deliberate orchestration of fear and manipulation intended to keep the household in disarray. As the fog deepened outside, Poirot's mind raced through possibilities, mapping opportunity, motive, and knowledge against each member of the household. The governess remained the most conspicuous in her subtle reactions, yet the possibility of an accomplice now demanded careful consideration. The villain was still several steps ahead, confident in their ability to manipulate perception and control the flow of events. Poirot understood that the next hours would be critical, that patience and precision were paramount, and that the resolution of the first crime was now inseparable from preventing another. The game had escalated, the stakes had risen, and the detective's small grey cells were already mobilizing, tracing every subtle cue, every shadowed pathway, toward the unveiling of the audacious mind hiding in plain sight. Poirot spent the night in quiet observation, moving silently through the Montclair estate, while the household remained restless and uneasy. The second incident had injected a sense of urgency into the investigation, yet the detective did not allow himself to be swept into panic. Instead, he observed the reactions of each member of the household with the same meticulous attention he had applied from the very first day. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitation was catalogued and measured. For in the delicate movements of human behavior, he knew, lay the subtle signals that would reveal the truth. As he retraced the events, Poirot's mind returned to the seemingly minor details: the chess pawn, the displaced blotter on Lady Eleanor's desk, the faint smudge near the rug where the pawn had rested, and the tiny footprint too light to be noticed by ordinary eyes. These details, which had at first appeared disparate, now began to align in a quiet, almost imperceptible pattern. He recalled the governess's habitual tendency to straighten objects with exact precision, a compulsive need to maintain order that had been observed repeatedly throughout the week. That same need had guided her hand in placing the pawn so that it would be seen, yet not immediately identified as a clue. Poirot's attention then shifted to the wording of the threatening note left for the nephew. Its carefully measured phrasing, its rhythm, and the almost deliberate smudge in the ink all bore the hallmark of someone accustomed to precise gestures. He compared the note to letters written by the governess in her personal ledger, and noted subtle consistencies: the slope of the letters, the minute loops in certain strokes, the consistent pressure at the end of words. It was a small, almost trivial set of details, yet together they formed a signature, a mark that now revealed the hand behind the recent acts. He considered the sequence of incidents: the initial murder of Lady Eleanor, the subtle misdirection with the cyanide vial, the psychological probing of the household, the disappearance of the chess pawn, and the threatening note left for the nephew. Each event had seemed isolated, designed to confuse and mislead, yet in Poirot's mind a pattern was emerging. The governing principle behind the chaos was not randomness but control, the manipulation of perception, the orchestration of fear, and the careful placement of symbols to suggest guilt where it did not belong. The governess, whose gestures had betrayed subtle cracks in composure, had acted with patience, precision, and an understanding of human psychology that made her movements appear almost incidental while serving a deliberate purpose. Poirot then reflected on the pawn itself, long the focal point of his investigation. He realized that it had been the key all along, not simply because it was a clue, but because it symbolized the method and intent of the criminal. The placement of the pawn, the scratch on its base, the engraving with initials and date, all pointed to someone intimately familiar with the household, someone who understood the interplay of history, memory, and perception. The governess's unconscious fixation on it, her reaction to its removal, and her calculated responses to probing discussions revealed the invisible thread connecting all the seemingly separate events. In addition, a small overlooked detail about her movements during the initial investigation now took on significance. Each time Poirot had left her alone briefly in the study, objects had shifted subtly, but nothing appeared disturbed to casual observation. The minor disturbances, slight smudges, shifted papers, faint imprints, were now coherent in context, indicating a deliberate rehearsal of manipulation, the careful construction of a false narrative intended to mislead authorities and observers alike. Even the threats against the nephew, delivered with psychological precision, were consistent with a mind methodically orchestrating tension to mask the truth of the initial crime. By morning, Poirot stood once more in the drawing room, reviewing the sequence of events and aligning the details with the behaviors he had observed. The pattern was unmistakable. The governess, motivated by hidden grievances connected to past family disputes, skilled in psychological manipulation, and methodical in her orchestration of both objects and perception, was the central actor in the chain of deception. The seemingly chaotic events now revealed themselves as a carefully constructed narrative, designed to confuse, intimidate, and conceal. The detective allowed himself a faint smile, knowing that the web, once opaque, had been illuminated by the smallest of details, and that the culmination of this painstakingly revealed pattern would soon lead to the exposure of the criminal hiding behind the veneer of propriety. Poirot summoned the household to the drawing-room once more, the early morning light filtering through tall windows and casting long, cold shadows across the polished floor. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Even the normally unflappable butler shifted uneasily, and the young nephew clutched his hands together, trying to steady the tremor in his fingers. Poirot's small grey cells had traced the pattern of events to a singular focus, and now it was time to reveal the deeper truth, the motive that had driven such meticulous calculation, such cold audacity. The governess sat rigid in her chair, her composure no longer complete. Poirot allowed a few moments of silence before speaking, letting the tension settle like a predator observing its prey. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm yet precise, "we have examined opportunity, observed deception, and uncovered the threads connecting past grievances to present actions. But there is more than anger, greed, or ambition at work. The heart of this crime is far subtler, far darker than mere material desire." He paused, letting the words sink in, and the governess's eyes flickered, betraying a trace of recognition and unease. Poirot traced the sequence of her actions, the careful placement of the chess pawn, the psychological manipulations. The theft of the vial, the threatening note, all were designed not merely to mislead, but to evoke fear, to assert dominance over those who had controlled or judged her throughout her life. The governess, it seemed, had grown in quiet resentment under the shadow of the Montclair family's influence, observing how small slights, dismissed complaints, and whispered judgments shaped her daily existence. Her intellect, once admired for its precision and poise, had been confined within the walls of propriety, the bounds of etiquette and expectation. The crime, Poirot realized, was an expression of her suppressed need for recognition, control, and acknowledgement, of her own power over the people she had long served. He spoke of her methodical planning, her psychological foresight, and the way she had manipulated both objects and behavior to create a narrative that misled all observers. It was not simply money, nor the inheritance, nor revenge in the conventional sense, he explained. It was the assertion of control, the demonstration of intellectual superiority, the quiet satisfaction of proving that one who is overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed can orchestrate events with precision beyond expectation. Poirot watched her carefully, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the brief flush of pride that crossed her face, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet revealing more than her words could ever admit. He recounted the previous incidents in careful sequence, how the chess pawn, the misplaced vial, and the threatening note were more than mere props. They were instruments of psychological domination, a game played not for wealth or revenge, but for the satisfaction of exerting control over perception itself. Each minor action, each seemingly trivial gesture, was meticulously calculated to elicit fear, to guide suspicion, and to leave observers doubting their own judgment. The governess had orchestrated a living puzzle, a tableau in which she remained invisible while directing the emotions and decisions of everyone around her. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, penetrating the layers of composure and subtle pretense. He described how her childhood had been marked by quiet oversight, how minor family indignities and the constant underestimation of her intellect had left an enduring mark on her psyche. The crime, far from impulsive, was a carefully structured expression of those years of restraint and suppressed assertion. The murder of Lady Eleanor, the misdirection and the threats were all parts of a single deliberate narrative, a demonstration that she, once invisible, could dictate events with a precision and control that no one had anticipated. Finally, Poirot concluded, the motive is the assertion of one's mind, the triumph of intellect over circumstance, the silent revenge of the overlooked. The crime is not merely an act, it is a statement. The governess's eyes, wide now, no longer hid the intricate pride mixed with fear. She realized that the carefully constructed facade had been penetrated, and that the intricate dance of deception she had orchestrated was laid bare before the detective who understood not just action, but intention, not just opportunity, but the very architecture of motive. Poirot's small grey cells had illuminated the hidden motive, a complex psychological need for recognition and control that explained with chilling clarity why she had been willing to go to such extremes. Poirot spent the morning arranging the household for the final reckoning, moving with deliberate calm while every member of the Montclair estate sensed the quiet tension in the air. He had traced the thread of deception to the governess, reconstructed her motives, and anticipated her next move. There was no need for haste or force, the trap woe. Would be psychological, subtle, and unyielding. He had prepared the stage, and now it was time for the final act. He asked the household to gather in the drawing-room once more, presenting it as a discussion of the investigation's progress. Every detail had been arranged with precision. The chessboard was set on the low table, the green pawn returned and positioned upright as if untouched, the curtains drawn to create an intimate circle of observation. Poirot allowed Langford to speak first, reviewing the events of the past days with careful neutrality, all the while watching the reactions of the governess. She sat stiffly, her eyes darting at intervals toward the pawn, her hands pressed tightly in her lap, a controlled mask slipping under the weight of anticipation. Poirot rose at last, moving toward the center of the room, his voice calm, authoritative, and tinged with the slight dramatic flair that always commanded attention. "Mes amis," he began, "we have examined every action, every hesitation, every shadowed movement in this household. We have traced opportunity, observed behavior, and noted the minute inconsistencies that betray intent. The pattern is now clear, and the mind behind it is revealed not only by action but by the very nature of the deception." He paused, allowing the stillness to settle heavily over the room. The governess's breathing became slightly faster, her composure beginning to fracture. Poirot's eyes met hers, sharp and unwavering, cataloguing the flicker of pride mingled with fear, the subtle tension of muscles she could no longer fully control. "You, madame," he said quietly but firmly, "have orchestrated a series of events so meticulously that even the police were misled. The chess pawn, the cyanide vial, the carefully placed notes, they were never random. They were instruments in a game you believed no one could see through." A faint gasp escaped her lips, barely audible, as her gaze fell to the chessboard. Poirot continued, stepping closer, his small hands gesturing toward the objects with calm precision. "Yet you miscalculated one thing, the consistency of human behavior. Every subtle tremor, every hesitation, every glance you believed unnoticed. These revealed the truth. You acted with the intellect of a master, yet under the pressure of observation, even a master can falter." For a moment, the governess's eyes darted to the door, calculating her next move, but Poirot's gaze held her, steady and unyielding. "You may attempt to deny, to deflect, to escape, yet the evidence is in every gesture you have made. The motive is no longer hidden. It is the assertion of your intellect, the demonstration of control over those who dismissed you. The crime was never merely about inheritance or revenge. It was about proving your mind's superiority, and that, madame, is a truth visible to all who watch closely." She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, a fleeting expression of desperation crossing her face. "You cannot prove," she began, but Poirot's voice cut through her protest with quiet authority. "It is not merely proof of action we require, madame, but acknowledgement of intent, and you have given it freely. Every tremor, every flicker of gaze, every deliberate placement of an object, all are confessions without the need for words." The governess hesitated, her eyes flicking once more to the doorway, weighing the possibility of flight. But Poirot's composed stance and the subtle positioning of the household created a barrier she could not overcome. Langford moved slightly to block her path, and the sense of inevitability pressed upon her. Her shoulders slumped, a breath escaped her lips, and the tension that had held the household in suspense dissolved into quiet resignation. Poirot approached, speaking softly. "It is over, madame. The game you believed you controlled has been revealed. Justice is not merely the law, it is the truth. And the truth has now been seen." The governess sank into a chair, her hands covering her face, the pride mingled with fear giving way to acknowledgement. The detective allowed a moment of silence, letting the gravity of the revelation settle before Langford moved forward to take the formal custody of the criminal. In the quiet that followed, Poirot examined the chessboard once more. The green pawn, now upright and unthreatened, symbolized not only the manipulation that had occurred, but also the subtle victory of observation, patience, and understanding. Every move, every gesture, every calculated misdirection had been catalogued, anticipated, and unraveled. The Montclair household, though shaken, was finally free of the shadow that had loomed over it, and Poirot, small, precise, and composed, allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The game was complete, and the truth, in all its intricate human complexity, had been revealed. The drawing-room, still heavy with the aftermath of the governess's confession, seemed to breathe with an uneasy calm. Langford had moved to secure her formally, while the rest of the household sank into chairs, a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension etched across their faces. Poirot, small and serene, remained standing near the fireplace, eyes sweeping the room with the habitual precision of one who leaves nothing to chance. Yet, even in the apparent closure, a faint instinct stirred within him, a subtle, almost imperceptible hint that the case, while resolved in appearance, might still conceal a deeper truth. He returned briefly to the study to inspect the chessboard, the green pawn resting upright as though nothing had transpired, and his eyes lingered on the faint scratch at its base. Something about it called to him, not as a clue of action, but as a symbol of intention beyond the governess's capabilities. He recalled the initial crime, the subtle misdirections, and the psychological games. All were consistent with her intellect and motive. And yet, there was a precision, an almost artistic manipulation of objects and reactions that suggested someone else had planned the broader framework of the chaos. Poirot's gaze narrowed, tracing the faintest disturbances in the dust near the window and the careful alignment of papers on the desk, details so subtle they would escape any ordinary observer. He requested that the household remain assembled while he spoke, and his voice, calm but commanding, carried across the room. "Mes amis," he said, "we have uncovered much in the past days. We have traced motive, observed behavior, and revealed the architect of recent events. Yet I feel that a final piece of the puzzle remains hidden, one that requires attention beyond what has already been revealed." A silence fell. Even the governess, seated and subdued, lifted her eyes cautiously, sensing the weight of the detective's words. Poirot's small hands gestured to the collection of objects used in the crimes, the vial, the pawn, the notes, and then toward the subtle, easily overlooked aspects of the study, the faint smudges along the hearth, the footprint impressions near the shelves, and the unassuming indentation on the blotter that suggested handling by a second pair of hands. "Observe carefully," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "The governess's cunning is undeniable, but the orchestration of misdirection, the placement of objects, the anticipation of suspicion exceeds even her capacity. Someone has guided the hand, someone who wished for chaos yet wished to remain unseen." The governess shifted uneasily, but before she could speak, Poirot approached the desk and lifted a single overlooked envelope tucked behind a row of books. The seal was unbroken, its presence unnoticed until now. He opened it, revealing a letter written in a fine, deliberate hand, one that matched neither the governess nor any other immediately obvious member of the household. Poirot read silently, his eyes scanning each line, absorbing the subtle arrogance and deliberate misdirection embedded in the phrasing. The words suggested not only intimate knowledge of the family's past, but also careful planning of the sequence of events, including the orchestration of the governess's role. As he looked up, Poirot's gaze fell on the butler, whose impassive demeanor had remained constant throughout the ordeal. The subtle clue in the letter, the reference to a minor family grievance that only someone long observing the household could know, aligned with what Poirot had noticed about the butler's meticulous habits, his almost invisible interventions in the study, and the silent way he had monitored all movements without appearing involved. Poirot's small grey cells clicked into place, recognizing the unseen hand that had guided the chaos from the shadows. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, aloud this time. "The governess has confessed to the acts she was capable of, yet she is but an instrument. The true mastermind has remained hidden, shaping events with the patience and subtlety of a grand strategist. The careful placement of objects, the manipulation of perception, the theft of evidence, all orchestrated to frame another while remaining unseen. The game is not yet complete." The room grew tense as Langford looked from Poirot to the butler, a flicker of doubt and alarm crossing his features. The governess's expression changed from relief to horror as realization dawned. She had believed herself in command, only to discover that she had been manipulated, a pawn in a far larger scheme. Poirot's serene smile betrayed no impatience, only the quiet satisfaction of a mind poised to unravel the final hidden layer. The last-minute twist had emerged, the apparent resolution was illusory, and the true architect of the crimes remained in the shadows. The detective's genius would be tested once more, for the final revelation required tracing the invisible hand that had guided every act, manipulated every suspicion, and nearly escaped detection entirely. The Montclair estate held its breath, caught between relief and apprehension, as Poirot, small, precise, and unflinching, prepared to expose the final truth. Poirot stood quietly in the drawing-room, allowing the tension to settle like a living thing among the assembled household. The governess remained seated, her composure shattered, while the butler, whose every movement had been impeccably measured over the past days, now shifted slightly under the unblinking gaze of the detective. The envelope, the letter it contained, and the subtle traces of manipulation that Poirot had uncovered were the final keys to the intricate puzzle that had so confounded Langford and the household. The truth, as Poirot knew, had always been hidden in plain sight, yet had required the patient threading of observation and deduction to be revealed. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority, "we have believed until this moment that we understood the sequence of events, that we had unveiled the hand behind the tragedy of Lady Eleanor, and indeed, we have discovered much. The governess, motivated by suppressed grievances, acting with precision and cleverness beyond expectation. Yet she is but one actor in a larger design." His eyes, sharp and penetrating, rested on the butler, whose impassive expression betrayed the smallest flicker of discomfort. Poirot recounted the subtle clues overlooked by others, the faint smudge along the hearth, the displaced papers, the footprints too light for ordinary notice, the slight shift of objects on the shelves that suggested manipulation by a second hand. Each clue, trivial on its own, had formed a lattice of evidence, pointing not only to action but to orchestration. The governess, clever though she is, could not have anticipated every reaction, every disruption. Someone else shaped the sequence, guided the chaos, and ensured the narrative remained convincing to observers. And that someone is— He allowed a deliberate pause, letting the room strain toward his revelation. "The butler," Poirot said softly, and the room seemed to exhale in collective shock. Langford's eyes widened, the governess's mouth opened slightly, and even the nephew clutched his chair with renewed fear. Notice, if you will, the subtle precision with which objects were placed and removed, the faint alignment of items to suggest guilt elsewhere, and the timing of movements within the household. A hand long accustomed to order, to observation, to quiet control, yet one that also understood human psychology enough to manipulate perception, guided events from the shadows. The butler's lips pressed into a thin line, a silent acknowledgement of the accusation, but before Langford could move to detain him, a soft creak from the corridor heralded his sudden disappearance. In the Confusio, the man had vanished, leaving only the faintest evidence of his exit. A door slightly ajar, a hurried footprint in the dust, and the lingering sense of meticulous intent. Poirot remained calm, unshaken, as the household erupted in murmurs of disbelief and fear. "Observe," he said quietly. "Even the act of escape is consistent with his character. Careful, precise, confident in his knowledge that subtlety and planning can outwit force and haste." Poirot turned to the governess, still seated and shaken. "Do not mistake the escape for triumph. The truth is known, the pattern revealed. The hidden clues, the psychological manipulations, the orchestrated diversions, all of these demonstrate the intellect of the true mastermind. Justice, in its broader sense, has been served, the deception is exposed, the motives are clear, and the actors' roles are understood. What remains is the measure of natural consequence and pursuit." He then walked the household through the final overlooked details, explaining how each action had left invisible traces, the slight indentation on the blotter where the pawn had rested, the smudges along the hearth, the carefully arranged letters and objects. These details, unnoticed by ordinary eyes, form a lattice of truth. Observe the chessboard, the pawn, restored to its place, symbolizes the careful orchestration and the manipulation of perception. The acts were deliberate, yet visible, if one knows how to look. Though the butler had escaped, leaving a shadow of unease, Poirot's explanation restored clarity to the household. The governess's culpability was acknowledged, her role delineated, and the mechanics of the crimes fully revealed. And yet, the knowledge that the true mastermind had walked free, if only temporarily, left an unsettling tension, a reminder that human cunning can slip through the grasp of justice even when observed by the most discerning eye. Poirot's small grey cells, ever vigilant, had traced every thread, anticipated every move, and illuminated the full tapestry of deception. Justice, in the form of truth and exposure, had been served, even as the true villain escaped into the shadows, a testament to the complexity of human intellect, the subtlety of misdirection, and the enduring challenge of a mind that remains always one step ahead. The Montclair estate, though scarred by fear and revelation, now understood the invisible hand behind the chaos, and Poirot, composed and meticulous, allowed himself the faintest smile of satisfaction, knowing that, though the game continued, the patterns and motives had finally been revealed. The Montclair estate had fallen into a tentative quiet by late afternoon. The governess was securely in custody. Langford had resumed his official duties, and the household, though shaken, began to regain a sense of order. Poirot, however, lingered near the drawing-room window, small hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the fading patterns of light on the polished floor. The orchestration of deceit had been unveiled, the true motives exposed, yet in the calm after the storm, he felt the familiar stir of that subtle, insistent instinct. Something remained unresolved. He retraced, in thought, every element of the investigation: the missing chess pawn, the cyanide vial, the threatening note, the subtle movements of the butler. Each detail had been examined, each reaction observed, each pattern unravelled. And yet, as he surveyed the room, his gaze fell upon a faint irregularity in the fireplace hearth, a mark that had been there since the very beginning, but had been dismissed as trivial. It was small, almost laughably insignificant, a slight smudge, curved like the tail of a question mark, almost imperceptible in the soft afternoon light. Poirot crouched to examine it, noting the subtle ridge of ash and the faint impression left beneath. It had not been part of the butler's escape or the governess's manipulations, nor did it align neatly with any other trace he had recorded. He straightened slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Some mysteries, he knew, linger not because they are unsolvable, but because they are patient, waiting to reveal themselves at the precise moment. Even a masterfully orchestrated sequence can conceal a final twist, a hidden whisper of intention, a suggestion that the game is not yet complete. He allowed himself a moment to appreciate the perfection of the setup, the human mind capable of weaving deception with elegance and subtlety, even if the truth has been largely revealed. As he prepared to leave the estate, Poirot addressed the remaining members of the household with his customary calm authority, outlining the conclusions of the investigation once more. He explained the sequence of events, the hidden motives, and the subtle cues that had exposed the governess's culpability, and, without mentioning the still vanishing butler, reinforced the importance of observation, patience, and the careful reading of human behavior. The household absorbed his words, nodding, murmuring in relief, yet the atmosphere retained the faintest edge of unease, the unspoken knowledge that the shadows still held secrets. Stepping onto the gravel path that led from the front door, Poirot breathed in the crisp air of early evening. The fog that had so often obscured his vision in past days had dissipated, leaving the estate visible in full detail, yet his mind remained alert, cataloguing every possibility, weighing every irregularity. Even as the governess had been apprehended, and the chain of deception largely disentangled, the faintest questions lingered in his mind, a misplaced shadow, a subtle discrepancy in timing, a footprint left by someone who had never been fully seen. These were not failures of deduction, he thought, but invitations to further inquiry. The butler, elusive and deliberate, remained a phantom at the edge of the investigation, a reminder that human cunning rarely rests, and that the games of perception and misdirection continue beyond the immediate resolution of events. Poirot's mind, ever restless, already began tracing the invisible threads, predicting the next potential moves, the quiet manipulations that could emerge if attention faltered. A true mystery, he reflected, never truly ends. It merely pauses, awaiting the moment when curiosity, observation, and intellect converge once more. As he walked down the winding path toward the waiting carriage, the last rays of sunlight glinted off the windows of the Montclair estate, casting elongated, shifting shadows that seemed almost alive. Poirot's gaze followed them briefly, then lifted to the horizon. The case had been largely resolved, justice delivered, and motives revealed, but the smallest details, the faintest irregularities, hinted that another layer still waited to be discovered, somewhere beyond immediate perception. He allowed himself a faint smile, the familiar thrill of anticipation settling over him. The world was full of puzzles, and the human mind, with its secrets and misdirections, remained the most intricate of all. The carriage door closed, and Poirot was on his way, leaving the estate behind, yet carrying every subtle clue, every observation, and every lingering question in his mind. Justice had been served, yet the shadows whispered that the game would continue, that mysteries never truly end. And for Hercule Poirot, small, precise, and ever observant, that was a promise he would always be ready to meet.